Okay, great. Well, we're going to go ahead and push on since we are staring at lunch there in the back of the room. So that's some incentive to make headway in our program. We want to make sure we leave plenty of time for our next speaker, who is Matt Hourahan. Matt is the Director of R&D Budget and Policy Program for the AAAS, where he is a regular source of information and analyses on past, present, and future science budgets. Prior to joining AAAS, he served as Clean Energy Policy Analyst at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. He also regularly coordinated congressional briefings, conferences, and events, brought together leading experts in government, industry, and academia. Previously, Matt served as Jan Shorey Fellow at the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, a coalition of energy firms and utilities working to engage policymakers for market-based solutions to sustainable energy development and climate change. He has a master's degree in public policy from George Mason University and a BA in journalism from Ithaca College. Welcome, Matt.
Cool. Hello, folks. Good morning. Nice to see you all. If that's too loud, let me know. Nice to see you all. I know I'm the last man standing between you and lunch, so I'm going to try to go pretty quick. And I was asked today to give you a basic introduction to the federal budget process. It's not a small topic. I mean, we could talk for hours about this, and I have. Mercifully, they've asked me to limit it to 45 minutes, so I'm going to try to hit the noon stopping point. But what I do want to do is try to just give you just a basic snapshot of the process, hopefully help you understand the different pieces, how they fit together, some of the influences on the federal budget process, ultimately helping you hopefully understand why the science budget is what it is and how government makes decisions about science spending. Because and let's be clear, most Americans have absolutely no freaking clue how any of this works. So I'm going to be operating at a pretty basic level here. Again, a very kind of brief introduction to some of the basic bits of the process. So I don't need to tell you federal dollars are incredibly important for science as much as anything else. Federal dollars are oxygen and lifeblood for federal science programs. Whatever you think government should be doing, if government should be doing more to cure cancer or put boots on the ground on Mars, or secure our national grid from cyber attack. It takes dollars to do it. Without dollars, there's no policy. And so from a science perspective, as well as just from a general national perspective, adopting a budget is probably the single most important thing government does every year. And certainly for science, federal government accounts for most basic research, most university research that's performed in this country. But budget matters for a lot of other people as well. We have a big country with a big electorate, a lot of different voters, a lot of different people with a lot of different value systems, a lot of different ideas about what government should be doing. And so we've got all of these differences, and we have a finite resource that these people are fighting over. The scarce resource of public dollars. If public dollars weren't scarce, we wouldn't need a budget process. You just figure out what you want to spend money on, and boom, there you are. But budget, we have scarcity in public dollars, and so budgeting ultimately is about choosing. Budgeting is choice, and the budget process is simply the process through which we make those choices. It's fundamentally about negotiation. At many steps of the process. It's a multi-step process, and at every point there's a key theme running throughout is negotiation. Often negotiation between people that have very different value systems and different ideas about what government should be doing. And when government makes choices, whether it's the executive branch or the legislative branch, those choices are influenced by many different things. We just heard from Al about the increasing interest in science of science policy and the SciSip program, developing more numerical metrics and concrete metrics for making decisions. But that's only one, the use of metrics, the use of evidence is really only one part of the budgeting process. I mean, the budget is very much about, well, all of the things listed down here. Values. I mean, the budget is often referred to as a moral document, and the process of budgeting, at a high level at least, is very much a value-driven process and proposition. Politics and political constituencies. I mean, make no mistake, NIH is a political organization, right? NSF, NASA, these are political organizations. They're science agencies, but they are political agencies as well. And there's many other factors that influence choices that government makes, power and control, trade-offs. Trade-offs, again, inherent idea within negotiation. Incrementalism, very central to our system, rules and institutions, and even merit, although I think reasonable people can often disagree on what merit means and who has it and who doesn't. So when we talk about the federal budget process, I mean, in a nutshell, this is it. In most basic form, this is it. Very much a kind of a simplified schematic of how it all fits together. Legislative branch has the power of the purse, right? That's written in the Constitution. They're the ones that actually make spending decisions. They write the actual spending bills that fund government. But the process starts in a different branch, in the executive branch. And it starts about 18 months in advance. So the federal fiscal year ends October 1st. This process takes 18, 19, 20 months or so to play out from the very beginning all the way through to the end. It takes 18 months to play out when things are operating as they should. Things haven't actually operated as they should since 1996. That was the last time. Is anybody in here born after 1996? No, okay, all right. I gave this talk to some undergrads a couple weeks ago, and everybody raised their hands, and it was kind of shocking. Like, none of them, Congress had not gotten its job done on time in their lifetimes. And hopefully that doesn't last forever. But it's been since 1996 that Congress has actually gotten appropriations done by October 1st. Every year since then, we've needed at least one small continuing resolution somewhere. In some years, Congress hasn't finalized things for 6 months into the fiscal year or more. So under regular order, which again that's the term for the way things are supposed to operate, it's about about an 18-month process. But regular order is basically irretrievably broken at this point. So I'm going to walk you through kind of the basic steps of this process, and again, kind of hopefully give you a feel for what's happening at each step and how it all kind of fits together. So the first step in this process is really happening within the agencies themselves. And again, this is about 18 months or so in advance of the fiscal year, starting October 1st. Agencies will really begin their planning for the upcoming budget request. And I should add, too, Congress has ultimate authority in spending questions. It's the executive branch and the president, the White House, that submits their budget to the legislative branch. But before the president can submit his budget to the Congress, agencies have to submit their budgets to the president. So that's kind of inherent in this first phase here. So what are agencies doing in this process? Well, starting in winter, say January, February, late winter, January, February time frame. Agencies separately. It's a very decentralized kind of bottom-up process over here. Agency heads and their senior staff. They're trying to figure out and establish their kind of big picture priorities. Establish perhaps they're scanning the opportunity space and trying to determine what they can achieve scientifically, technically. And that happens first, again, January, February, March timeframe, kind of high-level planning and priority setting. And then once we get into April, May, and these are rough dates. They may vary agency by agency, but generally speaking, April, May, and through the summer, things get much more rigorous within the agencies. Once they've established their high-level priorities, they've established their strategic plans. That's when we get much more concrete planning under various scenarios, trying to determine what resources they're going to need in a bottom-up fashion. So typically, maybe a given program will develop a budget request, proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year. They'll send that up the chain to the office level, up to the directorate level, et cetera. It's a hierarchical process with lots of kind of iteration and back and forth and discussion. Within an agency, as an agency is typically trying to determine what it wants to achieve, how much it's going to need to achieve its goals. Certainly agency heads, this is where, one way in which political appointees that run the agencies, cabinet secretaries and others, one way that they can shape the agency is through the budget process, through their own, fighting for their own priorities and establishing their own priorities and leading the agency accordingly. So agency heads and staff, they can have their own clear ideas of what an agency should be doing, what the opportunities are, how an agency can best fulfill its mission. But at the same time, agencies that are working the best, when an agency is at its best, it is developing and building and sustaining and drawing on relationships from outside the agency, of course. And there's lots of different channels agencies have to do that. I've got some listed here. Certainly there's a constellation of federal advisory councils and committees that periodically review agency programs, councils of visitors and committees of visitors and things like that review agency programs, serve as a source of advice, guidance, critique. What these advisory councils, and they're typically made up of bench scientists, academic researchers from the sort of disciplines served by those research programs. What they have to say can matter. Could matter to the agency, could matter to legislators if they don't feel like the agency is following the advice accordingly. For example, just one example, in the last couple of years, the high energy physics program at the Office of Science, their advisory council was involved in a long-term planning and priority setting exercise to develop a report to try to establish some new directions and new projects for the high energy physics research program. And that's the kind of thing that agency staff, again, when they're operating as they should, they can bring that feedback into their budget planning process. Beyond the formal advisory councils, you've also got a lot of other entities, of course, looking to influence or advise agency budget planning. Another big one is the national academies. NASA, the academies, some folks might not know this, the academies, they pursue decadal surveys for space science. And NASA uses these surveys and the priorities set in these surveys of the science community to establish their own budget priorities. So like the Jim Webb Space Telescope, for example, big project that NASA's been working on. Well, that was a major priority in an earlier decadal survey. And often you'll hear members of Congress, I guess this was last week, actually. Jim Bridenstine has been nominated to serve as the NASA director, and it came up during his nomination hearing. Somebody asked, are you planning on continuing to emphasize the use of the National Academy's decadal surveys in your budget planning and your operations for NASA? So what the external community has to say does matter quite a bit. The Human Genome Project, for example, it originated outside federal agencies, outside NIH. And so there is a lot of, when things are working as they should, there should be a lot of interaction, a lot of conversation, discussion, a lot of bog-satting. I don't know if that's a verb, but a lot of bog-satting to help agencies understand where they fit in, what the context is, and what they can achieve. At the same time, so while agencies are pursuing this, it's an incredibly, from an agency's perspective, incredibly detailed, information-intensive kind of process. While agencies are doing this, it's all done under the oversight of the White House, and two White House offices matter the most in this process. One, the big one, the really big one, is OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. I think Al might have mentioned them earlier. So OMB, that's the White House office responsible for, a few different things. But in this case, in this on this topic, they're responsible for overseeing development and approval of the president's budget. Their White House office of about, on the order of 400 or 500 employees, and they're headed by the OMB director is the president's budget director. So currently it's Mick Mulvaney, formerly of Congress, House of Representatives. And OMB, they're involved a couple different ways in this process. I mean, they'll provide guidance, overall planning guidance to the agencies in the spring. Think May timeframe. The OMB director will write a memo to the agencies providing some high-level guidance, maybe with some more detailed information agency by agency. And then later on in this process, agencies, they'll develop their budgets through the spring, through the summer, and then come fall, around September, they'll submit the budgets to the agencies, or to OMB. OMB will review their budget requests and send them back to the agencies with markups, changes, recommended, directives on things to increase, things to cut. Those are called passbacks when the OMB returns the budget to the agency. And OMB ultimately has to approve what agencies submit around December, January timeframe after an appeals process, usually. And so OMB, I guess a couple things I'll say about OMB. Their number one job in all this, no matter who's running the White House, their number one job is to constrain spending. Because, again, budgeting is choosing. Every administration, every White House, every president is going to have particular priorities. And every White House is going to want to make sure that those priorities are well represented in the budget. And one way to do that is to make sure that you're not spending more than you really need to on other things that aren't necessarily priorities. And generally, OMB seeks to be reasonable stewards of the public wallet, the public purse. And so OMB, when they constraining spending, that's part of their function in this is to operate is to review with a pretty fine-tooth comb, pretty rigorously, the agency budget submissions in the fall. And so an OMB, an OMB program examiner, when they're getting a budget proposal from, say, NSF or NIH or whoever, the kinds of questions they are going to ask of the agency head or whoever it is they're dealing with in the agency, they're going to be asking things like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing it for this much? Isn't there somebody else who can be doing this? Should you really be doing this? Shouldn't somebody else be doing this? How do you know this is working? How do you know this is successful? Is there a way we can save some money somehow? And it's a pretty rigorous review. The other thing, too, that OMB has to do is serve almost as a bridge or a mesh, integrating the big picture policy and political ideas coming from the White House with the more detailed program proposals and estimates coming from the agencies. And it's not always clear, if you're an OMB program examiner, it isn't always perfectly clear how choices you make and decisions you make on an agency's budget, I guess what's not clear is exactly how high-level, potentially vague directives coming from the White House may actually be translated into specific program choices within the agencies. For example, this administration, one of their big fiscal priorities is, for President Trump and Director Mulvaney has been cutting non-defense spending. And so the starting point for OMB was, in this most recent budget cycle, was and still is, from what we can tell, the non-defense budget's got to come down. So everybody's got to plan on being cut. And they may have some other priorities, within the science realm, at least in the FY18 budget, they may have had some other particular priorities. But for the most part, the White House was focused on cutting non-defense spending. So it was up to OMB to figure out what that actually meant, what that actually looked like agency by agency, which programs were going to suffer. And realistically, when you're talking about, say, a 20% reduction for NIH, there are a few programs that aren't going to suffer. But that's, OMB's job, is to find that balance between and translating the White House's big picture policy preferences into actionable budgets that can go before the Congress. In addition, beyond OMB, another important office in the White House is OSTP, the Office of Science and Tech Policy. And OSTP, they don't have, so OMB, they're the ones that, they're kind of the voice of God, right? They're the ones that actually have the power. They have final approval authority to say yes, no, sign off on what an agency wants to put before the Congress. OSTP doesn't have that power. Their power is, and I know there's lots of former OSTP folks scattered around the room, so I hope if you want to learn more about them, I hope you'll more about OSTP, you'll track them down. But OSTP, so they don't have that particular authority that OMB does. Their power is more about influence, building collaboration with the agencies. I mean, they're a source of advice, a source of guidance. OSTP oversees PCAST, the President's Council of Advisors, or they did oversee PCAST, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, when there was one. The National Science and Tech Council, et cetera. So, and OSTP basically serves as a coordinating it's coordinating function that OSTP serves, coordination and advice. And they also are able to have some influence. The most kind of specific form of influence that OSTP has in this process, I think, or kind of public and formal, is through every summer they release a joint priorities memo with OMB outlining particular areas for investment. So, for example, in the Obama years, OSTP and OMB would get together. They'd write their joint memo highlighting, say, climate change, low carbon energy technology, neuroscience, STEM education, and that joint memo that OSTP releases with OMB every summer. Whatever appears in that list of priorities, there's a pretty good bet that it's going to be emphasized in the budget that comes later on. So we get through this process. Ultimately, OMB has to, and the president has to approve everything that the agencies put forth around January. And then we get to February, the president's budget comes out. And this is a typical budget. This is actually the president's budget request, President Trump's request for the 2018 fiscal year. It was issued in full in May. And that's pretty standard for a transition year. February is when the budget's supposed to come out, but in a transition, it's always late by a month or two or three. And so this is the budget request for 2018. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, although I did want to just point out, I mean, if you want to understand the federal budget, one place to start is the basic distinction between two different categories in the budget. So the red and the blue, that's your discretionary spending. Okay, that's one kind of spending, is discretionary. Then the gray shades, this is mandatory spending. That's the other kind of spending. A couple of differences between these two. One of them is timing. So mandatory spending, and especially, you've got your big entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Most of this is on autopilot. Not all of it, but maybe 60 or 70% of it, of the mandatory budget, is on autopilot. It means Congress doesn't really need to intervene each year. It's set up to automatically go out the door. The discretionary budget is that's the part of the budget that Congress actually allocates every year through the appropriations process. So every year when Congress is debating the budget resolution, debating different spending bills, the NIH budget, all of that stuff is contained in the discretionary part of the budget. So, and there are different factors. I mean, the fact that you've got different timing for each part of the budget. Also the fact that these are, big, unified, powerful, popular programs, the entitlement programs. The fact that, a lot of the non-defense programs, non-defense, that's pretty much every federal agency you can think of. So, for science, NSF, NIH, NASA, USDA, but also, Department of Labor, Department of, EPA, Department of Commerce, run down the list. They're all going to be contained in there. So you've got lots and lots of different kinds of programs kind of packed into a relatively small slice of the federal budget, which means their political support for those programs is going to be a little bit more diffuse, I think. You've also got an aging population, rising healthcare costs. So, one of the basic trends in federal spending over many years has been the mandatory part of the budget has been growing quite a bit, actually. If you go back to, say, the space race, the years of JFK and LBJ, the discretionary budget was about 2/3 or 3/4 of all spending. The mandatory budget was about 1/3 or 1/4 of all spending. And this part of the budget, the mandatory part has grown, the discretionary part has shrunk. Now, just about all federal R&D is in the discretionary part of the budget. And in fact, it doesn't tend to change a whole lot as a share of the discretionary part of the budget. So as mandatory spending has grown and discretionary spending has shrunk relative to the budget, relative to the economy, it's brought science spending down with it. So that fact, and simply the fact of choosing, between discretionary versus mandatory, that is a choice that Congress makes and can make if they want to. But the decline in discretionary spending that's been maybe the biggest driver. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard the numbers that get thrown out. Federal R&D has declined as a share of GDP from 2% in the space race to less than 1% today. Big motivator is the decline in discretionary spending. So the composition of the budget matters a whole lot. The context, that's the fiscal context, matters a whole lot for the R&D budget. Am I going? Oh, I'm holding it upside down. Okay. Okay. So anyway, and so you can see, R&D is a very small portion of the overall federal budget, about 3.4%. This is what the R&D budget looks like for 2018. And this is, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Again, this is pretty standard, and this budget doesn't change a whole lot year to year in its overall composition. The big difference, though, is that DoD, Department of Defense, usually is about half of the R&D budget, has been lately. And the Trump administration would shrink the non-defense portion of the R&D budget and expand the defense portion. And most of the DoD budget is the kind of downstream systems engineering that Bill had mentioned earlier. So just throwing this up there. So DoD, NIH, DOE, NASA, we've got a lot more information of this kind on our website if you want to check that out. So, okay. So that's the budget. Budget comes out in February, and then it moves over to Congress, to the legislative branch. I mentioned earlier, Congress has the power of the purse. They're the ones that actually make the spending decisions. Now, if they're the ones that actually have the power, and by global standards, Congress has a lot of power in the budget process. Does that mean, given the power that Congress has, does the president's budget even matter? That's a common question I get, and I think the answer is in some way. In some ways it does, in some ways it doesn't. Start with the way it doesn't matter first. Overall spending levels, which is really what people think about when they think of the budget, probably didn't matter a whole lot. The Trump administration sought a lot of big cuts for a lot of most science programs. Most of them were ignored. Not all of them, and not entirely, but most of them were ignored. President Obama, before President Trump, a lot of requests, a lot of things that were completely ignored by Congress. Congress kind of has what you might think of as an Overton window on spending questions. There's in any given year, there's going to be a box in which Congress is going to be, willing to operate fiscally. There's a box in which they're going to be setting their spending decisions on an NIH or a NASA. If a president's budget ends up hitting that space where Congress is likely to be, then maybe the spending levels matter. But most presidents operate outside. They've got their own priorities. They operate outside that box that Congress is willing to operate in. And so most presidents' budgets, again, in terms of total numbers, don't matter a whole lot. Because budgeting really, a lot of it is what happens at the margins, because we do have an incremental system. And so often what a president wants to see change at the margins in terms of science spending, Congress is free to ignore it, and they often do. What does matter, though, and the way a president's budget does matter in this process, is not so much in overall spending levels, but in concrete or substantive program proposals or changes. And by that I mean, for example, go back to the Obama era. President Obama always sought major increases in low-carbon energy technology. Rarely, if ever, got them. Mostly didn't get them. But within those big increases, the Obama administration also proposed, for example, the creation of the Energy Innovation Hub and the list of programs that Bill showed you earlier. I mean, those are mostly Obama-era proposals, and proposals that Congress adopted even as they were completely rejecting 30% increases for the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, for example. Similar story than NIH. I mean, President Obama regularly sought, not regularly, but often sought fairly sizable increases for NIH. Didn't get most of them, but the Obama administration also proposed the BRAIN Initiative, which we have now. Towards the end, the Cancer Moonshot. I mean, so those are the substantive programs, priorities, initiatives. That's the stuff I think in the president's budget that's really influential. When you see a president propose a $2 billion increase for NIH or a $2 billion decrease for NIH, I mean, great, applaud them or critique their, or oppose them, whatever you think should happen. But just remember that a lot of those numbers just don't matter, and especially again this year with a budget that Congress is not inclined to support. So, all right, I'm going to try to move quickly here. So, once we get to the congressional process. Budget's out in February in a typical year. Congress will hold hearings, gather information from their colleagues. A lot of debates happen. One of the first things that's supposed to happen is the adoption of a budget resolution. And I'll make this easy. So the budget resolution is basically the congressional budget process, or it's congressional budget. And whereas the president's budget is ridiculously detailed, thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of information on federal programs. The congressional budget, the budget resolution, is almost the inverse. It only contains a few key pieces of information. For our purposes, the only thing that matters in the budget resolution, for the most part, is an overall target for discretionary spending. Now, I mentioned earlier, discretionary spending, again, that's about 1/3 of the federal budget or so. Well, the budget resolution is the mechanism through which Congress and congressional leadership especially establishes an overall discretionary spending target. So whatever the president asked for, let's say the president, and President Obama did this often, the president asked for an increase of 5% in the discretionary budget. Well, that's all fine and good, but if the Congress isn't willing to adopt that overall discretionary spending increase, again, the president's budget isn't going to matter a whole lot. So the budget resolution is very much a political document, but it basically sets the size of the, in establishing a discretionary spending limit, and the process through which the Congress chooses that limit. Again, it's political. If we have time, maybe during Q&A, we can talk a little more about what that sometimes can look like. But anyway, so Congress establishes its overall discretionary spending target. That choice is influenced by, big picture political ideas, deficits, debt, spending, size of government, all that kind of thing. And once Congress has done that, and they often don't, we're going to skip that just for the sake of time. Suffice to say, the discretionary budget, as I said before, matters a lot for science spending because science agencies don't tend to change a whole lot as a share of the discretionary budget in the aggregate. So when discretionary spending goes up, science spending goes up. When discretionary spending comes down, science spending comes down. And one could argue, and I would argue, that the single best indicator of how science is going to do in any given year is what the discretionary budget's going to do. All the debates we have over individual agencies, discretionary spending is the big determining factor. I don't want to overstate it too much, but it really is incredibly influential on what actually happens agency by agency. And it's influential because once Congress has adopted a budget resolution, knows its discretionary spending target, that discretionary spending target, it's connected with the appropriations process formally. So basically, the budget committees, when they write their budget resolution, when Congress adopts a resolution, let's say it's $1 trillion or $1.1 trillion or whatever, the chairs of the appropriations committees, who are the ones that actually write the spending bills, make the spending decisions, they'll take that overall target and they'll chop it up into 12 pieces. Now, each appropriations committee is divided up into 12 subcommittees. That's this thing that looks like a jellyfish from hell. That's the appropriations committees. So the appropriations committees are divided up into 12 subcommittees, 12 in the House, 12 in the Senate. And each subcommittee is responsible for writing a single spending bill. So when the chairs of the appropriations committees take that overall discretionary spending target, chop it into 12 pieces, well, those 12 pieces are the new caps on the size of each individual spending bill. So if I've got $1 trillion to work with, maybe I take $500 billion or $600 billion, and that's my defense bill, and that goes to the defense subcommittee. I take $40 million, and that's my energy and water spending bill. That goes to the energy and water subcommittee. So through that mechanism, congressional leadership, through that budget resolution to appropriations committee mechanism, that's how congressional leadership translates its big picture political ideas, big picture political compromises over spending, over size of government, all of those kind of big questions, and translate them directly into constraints on the appropriations process. So again, that's another big reason why discretionary spending matters, because the size of each individual, or the size of discretionary, the size of the discretionary budget influences the size of individual spending bills quite directly. So as far as appropriations goes, I mean, again, just to be kind of very quickly, a lot of different things come into play, just like on the executive branch side, a lot of different factors come into play. Same story on the appropriations side. Congress, again, it's a political entity. The two things I would highlight, though, number one, I mean, all politics is local. That's a statement, it's a quote from Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House in the 1980s. And it's as true for science spending as anything else. I mean, it's not a coincidence that some of the biggest supporters of the research enterprise in Congress have either national labs or major research universities or high-tech industry or federal agencies in their districts. It's not the only factor, but it's a big one. It does matter. And it matters, for what they think may be happening on what they want to see on the appropriations front. It's also important, typically, I mean, the chairs of the appropriations committees are the ones, it's their staff who are writing the bills. And it's also important to get a bill that can pass. So, again, there's an idea of trade-offs, of balance, of trying to satisfy competing interests. So very quickly, to try to give you an idea of how this actually sort of happens in practice. I mean, this is sort of a very kind of basic snapshot. And there's a lot of other stuff that goes into play in each bill, each subcommittee. But just to kind of give you a sense, just to walk you through the Energy and Water Subcommittee and how kind of some decisions have played out in there lately and how these different factors come into play. So the Energy and Water Subcommittee, they write the Energy and Water Spending Bill. It's the one that funds the Department of Energy. So the composition of the bill is over here. I don't know, you probably can't read this, but the bill is about $38 to $40 billion. That's how big it is. Big chunk of it is devoted to the National Nuclear Security Administration. Always a big priority, especially for Republicans, but Democrats as well. Big chunk of it is for defense cleanup, nuclear waste cleanup. Another big chunk is for the Army Corps of Engineers. Defense is always going to be a big issue. Nuclear cleanup, Army Corps. I mean, those are two issues that are often prominent locally. So you've already got more than half of your bill is already taken up by these three programs. So then one of the decisions you're left with is, how do you allocate the remainder? Let's say you want to see NNSA get some kind of a plus up. You want to take care of your constituents want you to take care of waste cleanup. Your constituents want you to take care of the Army Corps. Maybe there's a canal that you need dredged, or there are earthworks that need to be repaired. So, you're going to fight for the Army Corps' allocation. And then you still got only about a third of the bill left for the Office of Science, for DOE's applied technology programs. So how do you make those decisions? Well, I mean, two factors that matter, or one factor that matters in both chambers. So the chairs, Mike Simpson and Lamar Alexander, both of them have a national lab in their district. Lamar Alexander, one of the biggest supporters of science spending and a big protector of the Office of Science in the Congress. He's got Oak Ridge Lab in Tennessee. And so he's been an advocate. He's been a proponent of doubling the Office of Science budget. Again, that's partly going to be because of who he's got in his district and the relationships that Oak Ridge Lab, has built with his office. So that's a part of it. The fact that you've got, the chairs are predisposed to favor, basic research and the national labs. In addition, you've got that's the local aspect. You've also got the ideological aspect. And Bill mentioned earlier, the DOE has been, there's been an effort in federal agencies to grow and expand applied research and technology programs beyond fundamental science. Well, that is an ideologically thorny issue. A lot of Republicans are perfectly comfortable with government doing basic research, fundamental research. It's once government gets beyond basic science into the applied realm. So in this case, for example, DOE's energy technology programs, there are many who make the case, and I think they're mistaken, but they make the case that a lot of what happens in those applied programs, in renewables, fossil energy, efficiency, nuclear, a lot of those activities are better left to the private sector. And that's the Trump administration's position as well. So given those two factors, one might expect the Office of Science to fare better than the applied programs. And in fact, it has over the last few years. The Office of Science ends up getting, even when the bill is shrinking. And this year's Senate bill, the House bill, I believe, was a couple of $1 billion less this year than last year's bill. The Office of Science was flat funded, which is, again, not a great outcome, but better than it could have been, I guess. Whereas the applied programs are the ones that have been cut. Another way that decisions matter in the two chambers, or another factor that influences the decisions made in the two chambers, are the rules. In the Senate, appropriations bills can be filibustered. They require a 60-vote majority, just like any other piece of legislation. And so the minority in the Senate has a lot more power than the minority in the House. So in the House, where there are the folks who have an ideological disposition to oppose applied technology programs, they're able to flex their muscles, and we often see deeper cuts in the House for a lot of those, the applied tech programs relative to the Senate. Senate numbers are often a lot more. Basically, generally, the Senate often moderates what the House does because of that 60-vote requirement in the Senate. So you've got this mix again. And there's other factors as well, but you've got this mix of local interests, belief. I haven't really mentioned this, but just simply belief in the national interest, what's good for the country, but also ideology, and differences over government's role, and all of these ideas come together. And when they're writing these spending bills, they've got to, the staff and others have to kind of keep, these are factors that influence legislators' positions. And so when staff is writing these bills, they've got to keep those positions in mind. Another way, actually, last thing I'll mention, since it came up and Bill mentioned these, a lot of those new institutes at DOE almost all of them were zeroed out in the administration's budget request. So another way that the request may not matter a whole lot. The administration zeroed out a lot of those programs, the innovation hubs, the manufacturing institutes in the budget request. They were almost completely saved in the Senate bill and mostly saved in the House bill eventually. The original House bill adopted a lot of those cuts, but some of them are restored on the House floor. Not all of them are back in there. And again, that's because a lot of these activities, they're the part of establishing a new program like that is building congressional support. And so, somebody like, I'm not sure if Marcy Kaptur of Ohio, if she actually has a hub in her district, but Ohio, naturally a big manufacturing state, these. Ohio was the first. Is it? Okay, so there you are. So then, yeah, so anyway. Yeah, right, yeah. So, those programs have a presence in Ohio. So, anyway, so these are just some of the factors again that kind of come into play. And that's DOE. NIH maybe the last thing I'll say, just very quickly, I'm going to skip to the end here, but in spite of, one of the problems we've had, NIH, maybe the single best example of why the president's budget doesn't matter so much, because NIH is, one could argue, the single most popular science agency in the Congress. President Trump proposed it was an 18% reduction or something. Throw that out. $1.1 billion increase in the House, a $2 billion increase proposed in the Senate, and this is like the third year in a row that they've pulled out these numbers. All four of the chairs and the subcommittee members, or the ranking members on this subcommittee, are big-time NIH supporters. And different agencies fare differently. Let's see. Okay, so anyway, so the subcommittees, they're writing their spending bills. Those bills have to pass have to be adopted in at the subcommittee level, the full committee level, then on the chamber floor in the House and the Senate. Eventually, you've got two different versions of each spending bill. A conference committee is formed to resolve the differences between the two versions of the bill, and that produces a final bill that goes to the president's desk for a signature, although he can veto those bills if he so chooses. And that's got to be done by October 1st. If that is not done by October 1st, again, and it hasn't been since 1996, Congress has the option of passing a continuing resolution, which simply takes current spending levels and extends them for as long as they think is appropriate, a week or a month or 6 months or whatever. We're under a continuing resolution right now. It runs through December 8th, although there's some talk of adopting another resolution to extend spending yet further, beyond that. So we're actually well afternoon, so I'm going to wrap up here. Maybe we'll do just a couple of Q&As before lunch. But while I'm doing that, I'm just going to leave this up here. You can see variations of this on our website as well. This just simply shows you exactly how appropriations have played out so far on the science front. The orange is the White House proposals, and then the House and the Senate in different shades of blue. Main thing to note here, I mentioned earlier, the idea that there's more agreement over basic science and a lot more disagreement over applied science and technology for a variety of reasons, and that very clearly has shown up in spending decisions this year so far. NIH has done fine. NSF, Office of Science, have done okay. But then a lot of the applied programs, technology programs at DOE, DHS, certainly EPA, environmental research, a lot of the applied programs, the industrial competitiveness programs at NIST have been targeted. And again, that's pretty much what we'd expect. Because the other thing, too, is, I didn't get into this, but discretionary spending under current law isn't going to change a whole lot. The House would like to reduce non-defense discretionary spending a bit more than what's going to happen under current law. But basically, this is a year where discretionary spending isn't changing radically. It's not like the sequester year where discretionary spending came way down. So given relatively stable, not entirely stable, but relatively stable discretionary spending, and then those ideological differences and the other factors I mentioned, this is not a great year, and also not a surprising year for science and tech. But if Congress, there is the possibility that Congress can get together and come up with a spending deal to raise the spending caps that are in place, thereby increasing the size of the discretionary budget. And if Congress can increase the size of the discretionary budget, then these numbers, almost across the board should look a lot better. But that's, remains to be determined. So, okay, I'm going to wrap up there and do a question or two before lunch. So. Yeah. NIH, most of the funding is competitive grants. About half of the NIH budget is your standard R1 that's all competitively awarded, allocated, through peer review. So yeah, I mean, and other, NIH spending is awarded similarly. So I mean, people don't tend to. I mean, I guess I'd say that people don't tend to fight over disease research spending as a means for achieving any kind of like regional or local political goals. Not in the same way. Somebody may fight over other, you may fight for a computing research program because you've got a major computing facility in your district. But that kind of thing doesn't really happen quite so much for NIH. The thing too about NIH is that most individual institutes tend to move fairly steadily together. I mean, you'll have years, and this is another one where, the Institute on Aging, with their Alzheimer's research activities, I mean, they'd get a huge boost in both bills, but most institutes will get, if NIH overall is getting a 3% increase, then most institutes are going to get something in that range. That's kind of has been standard practice for a while. So and I saw over here.
Question in relation to this graph and the Trump administration record of confirmations and bringing people into politically appointed positions. How do you think that has affected the relationship with some of the staff on the subcommittees in terms of how agencies relate to subcommittees and budgetary proposals? DOE science is way down, and it looks like 68% of the political appointed positions in the Department of Energy are unfunded. So that suggests to me that there's maybe something. I mean, I'm completely sprayed.
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, so to some extent, appropriators are going to have their own ideas of what's going to happen, and that I don't know how much that's going to be influenced by, lack of political appointee. I don't know. What do you guys think?
That's a great question. I mean, normally, if there isn't a political leader in place, it would be a senior level career person who would be asked to either testify or go provide a briefing on the budget. I think it can matter to have a really experienced advocate, one way or the other, in a position of political influence. But you could also have just a really solid career person who's very knowledgeable on the program who can.
That's Chris, because he did congressional affairs for DOE. Yeah, I was just going to say, the orange bar you see was formulated almost entirely with a comparatively small number of people for the budget process, right? I mean, and very few people at the agencies that were there to defend the programs of the agencies to OMB. The whole process that Matt is describing here is very much built on tension, right? And just sort of constant tension. And it actually can be a very heated exchange all throughout the entire process. In many cases, there were not people there for that exchange. It was simply a one-way. OMB said this is what it will be, and it was not someone there to defend program by program. And that's just an executive branch. So without the right set of connected senior political operatives at the agency level, and I would argue also with OCD, providing pushback against OMB's overall desire to just cut, then they will cut, right? So you could look at these numbers, the orange ones, and say, oh, you match this up to where there were Trump administration political operatives, whether they're nominees, presidentially nominated secretary or just political operatives, right, in those agencies. And it doesn't always bear out because, for example, NIH only has like a couple of political operatives, but they have a seasoned operative head of NIH. So I would say the bigger issue here is the time frame of the presidential cycle. It was a weird cycle. It was a very tight budget. Weird cycle this time, but what happens in the first year of any administration is you have a small number of political appointees, and the first year's budget is done by a very small number of people in the president's inner circle. And OMB this year didn't include any of those. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and there's actually precedent for that. I'll end here, then we can finally eat lunch. But the timing question is really important, and this was a top-down process this year, and that's a pattern that we've seen before. President Reagan, similar story. Actually, a lot of similarities in many ways. new incoming administration campaigned on, among other things, the idea of cutting federal spending, very much prioritized cuts in non-defense spending. And so, to some extent, just like the Trump administration, the Reagan administration, you can see a lot of similarities. Again, skepticism of applied federal, science and technology programs, skepticism of environmental programs, research programs. Now, Reagan, one difference is, beyond defense, science, and tech, the Reagan administration actually was marginally better on basic research. So the Trump administration's budget is certainly a lot more, even more ideologically, kind of cohesive than the Reagan administration's budget was in a way. But again, in both cases, you're going to have these are budgets where, as has been said, it's a budgets written by political leadership with very clear political ideas, not necessarily trying to resolve differences with agencies or accept feedback. It's much more of a top-down issue. To me, these are actually, it's really interesting to me, just the fact that these are as similar as they are in some ways, and then the differences are also instructive as well. So, okay.
This follows on with
Okay.
line of discussion. Would you say, in your long experience now, that there is a deficit in STEM educated and literate people in Congress because these young people in this room, many of whom are students in STEM fields, science and engineering fields, but other fields, are probably wondering about career paths.
Sure.
And that's what we do. And so, would you just reflect on that? How
Yeah.
scientifically and technically is Congress, and are they equipped to do this difficult process?
Not very. You have, at least among elected members, I don't know what the count is now, but it's very, very small, very small. The numbers with advanced degrees in any kind of science or engineering field. There's one. Well, it's Foster, but then there's a few others. But its point is numbers small.
So
Yeah.
they depend on their staffers.
Depend very much on staff. Yeah. Exactly.
What's coming up with that? Isn't there a future for many of these young people?
I don't see why not. I don't see why not.
Beginning with internships.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. It was. Yeah. Right. All right. Well, thanks all. And my info is, I think I flashed past it. Feel free to shoot me an email or call if you got other questions about the budget process. Happy to chat anytime. So, thanks.